Hi guys, this is Dr. Momsilovich with your lecture 12.1 on trophic levels and energy. This is the first lecture in a series of lectures on community ecology. So let's start by reviewing what a community is. A community is a group of populations of different species that live in the same area and can potentially interact with one another. So in this case, we could say that it's the community of birds and insects and bacteria and other microbes and things that live in your backyard. It could be the community of bears and wolves and elk and moose and birds and things like that that are living up in the Denali National Park in Alaska. It could be the community of the grasses and trees and lions and zebras and elephants and giraffes and the monkeys and the hyenas and the bacteria and all those things that are living in the savanna in Africa. So it's just a group of populations of different species in the same area that have the potential to interact with one another. And community ecology looks at the way that those species interact with one another and the consequences for each of those species. So when we're looking at different communities, we can look at a few different characteristics. So we can look at the species that are present, the abundance of the species that are present, so how many different individuals of each species are there, and importantly, how do those species interact with one another and influence each other? One part of community structure that we can talk about, and one of the most important ones, is species richness. So this is one of the most widely used measures of community structure, and it is what describes the number of species in a community. So we can say that there are 5 species in my backyard, or if I had a more diverse community living in the backyard, it would be 50. So it's just giving you the number of species that live in an area. And we've talked about different reasons why there are more species in some parts of the planet than in others. So species richness is just the number of species in any given area. We can also look at the way a community is structured by looking at consumer resource relationships. In any community, there are different types of organisms that have different roles. Producers are things that we would also refer to as photoautotrophs, meaning that they do photosynthesis and create their own food using energy from the sun, as well as other materials like carbon dioxide and water. Consumers are things that eat producers, and these are we also call heterotrophs because they don't make their own food, they're eating something else. Decomposers get their energy by decomposing the dead material from living organisms, and we call these detritivores. Within any ecosystem and within any community, there are complex relationships between these different types of organisms. So we can call our producers or our autotrophs, those are our plants. They're getting their energy from the sun. That energy then gets transferred to herbivores. Herbivores are organisms that only eat plant material, not material from other animals. Carnivores then eat the herbivores. They get their energy from the body tissues of herbivores. When any of those organisms, producers, herbivores, or carnivores, die, decomposers will feed on their dead body matter and release energy and get their own energy that way while releasing minerals back into the soil. So when we're looking at the At this graph on the bottom right-hand side of your screen, the yellow arrows are important because they're showing the energy movement within the system. Energy comes from the sun, producers turn that into usable energy, herbivores eat the producers, carnivores eat the herbivores, and then decomposers use any leftover energy from those organisms. We can look at the flow of energy through an ecosystem in what we call a food chain. A food chain is just a sequence where you have a plant that is eaten by an herbivore, which is eaten by a secondary consumer, which is eaten by a tertiary consumer, etc. And we can diagram this and show the flow of energy through different trophic levels. Our food chain, therefore, is going to represent the feeding relationships as a linear flow of energy through our community. And each species in the food chain represents a trophic level. So at the bottom of this food chain, we have our producer, which in this case is the creosote bush. We then have the Sonoran harvesting ants, which eat parts of that creosote bush and use that for their food. They're a primary consumer. Secondary consumer in this would be horned lizards, which eat the ants. And then we have the roadrunners who will eat the horned lizards, and they are tertiary consumers. And so you can see the flow of energy from the plants that are using the sun to create energy all the way up through this ecosystem and through this community, where it starts with the plants, works its way through the ants to the horned lizards, and then into the roadrunners. Trophic levels can also be represented by numbers starting at the level 1 with plants, and then the further along in the trophic levels are numbered sequentially according to how far the organism is along that food chain. So level 1 is always going to be plants or algae, and these are things that make their own food, and we call them producers. Everything else is a consumer. So level 2 are primary consumers, which are herbivores that eat plants. Level 3 are secondary consumers, which are carnivores that eat herbivores. Level 4 are tertiary consumers, which are carnivores that eat other carnivores. You can have up to quaternary consumers, which would be one level up from this, and that's usually about as high up as you can go in a food chain. The number of levels in your food chain is based on the productivity of the plants. So the more productivity you have in level 1, the more levels within your food chain you're going to be able to support. So if you think about something like a tropical rainforest that has a lot of different types of plants and a lot of plant material, there are many, many levels. We're going to have up to level 5 in that type of an ecosystem because there's so much plant diversity that it's supporting lots of herbivores, which can support lots of carnivores, and then lots of tertiary and quaternary carnivores. Something like the desert, where there is less plant productivity, would have fewer trophic levels. Apex predators are any species that have no predators and at the top of their food web. So anything that does not have another species that naturally preys upon it and will only die because of old age, starvation, competition with something else, and then its body gets decomposed by detritivores, that would be an apex predator. So this is when we think about things like lions and tigers, humans, things like that are apex predators because they have no natural predators. For this next slide, I don't want you to panic and think that you need to memorize all of this. I just want to point out to you that trophic levels are not the only way that we can categorize different organisms and different species within a community. So there's also the Getz categorization, which is shown here, and it just gives a little bit more detail on the roles of different things in our ecosystem. So It is based on whether things are plants or animals and whether they're eating things that are dead or alive. So, for example, if we look at lectivore, a lectivore is something that eats dead plants. Okay, an herbivore is something that is eating plants in general. A victivore is something that's eating live plants. So it's just a little bit more of a descriptive way of describing that individual. If we look down at that sort of darker shaded part, if you see where it says necrophage, a necrophage is something that eats dead and dying animal mass. This one is particularly interesting to me because for my master's and PhD projects, I studied burying beetles. Burying beetles are of the genus Microphorus, and so what they do is they use dead, like small mammal carcasses for their food and reproduction. So field mice and small birds, things like that. That's what they eat. And they lay their eggs around it and let their offspring eat the dead and dying animal carcasses. And so they would be considered necrophages because they are animals that eat other dead animals. So don't go and memorize any of this. It's just to give you an idea that there are other ways of describing different organisms, and sometimes we need a little bit more descriptive words to describe the role of an organism in an ecosystem. So within any community, there's never going to be just one food chain because there are many, many different types of species. So there's actually several different food chains and they are interconnected to make food webs. So this is a really nice example of an aquatic food web where you have multiple different types of producers, multiple different types of species at a level 2, 3, and 4. And you can see that for the producers, some of them are eaten by only one herbivore, some are eaten by more than that. And as we go up, you can see that the organisms at the top, which are piscivorous birds, which are birds that eat fish, those occur above the level 4. So those are actually at a level 5. And if you look also at the top, it says artisanal fishery. So this would be someone who goes out and catches fish and cooks them up for dinner. So in that case, if you are eating fish as an artisanal fisherman, you are at a level 5 in this trophic level. However, if you were to eat clams, which are at a level 2, you would actually be at a level 3 because you're eating the things at the level 2. So you can look at the things that you eat and kind of find out where you actually fall on a trophic level. So if you were to have a meal that included both some type of fish as well as clams, you would average out to being about a level 4 or so. And so what you eat most of the time determines your level within this a food web. There are actually 3 different ways that we can portray the relationships in food webs. So we can do what we call connectedness webs, where we emphasize the feeding relationships as links in a food web. So in this case, we're just showing who eats who. So if you look at the Catharina, which is that middle species, you can see that it eats benthic diatoms and alaria and hedophyllum and all of these different things. It's not showing what they eat most of the time. It's just showing who eats what within this community. The next type of food web that we can do is called an energy flow web. And this represents an ecosystem viewpoint where the connections between species are quantified by the flux of energy. So it's instead of just showing the connections between the species, it's now showing how much energy each species gets from the other. So in that case, even though Catharina is getting energy from 4 different species, it's getting the majority of its energy from heterophyllum, not benthic diatoms or either of the other two. We can also look at them as functional food webs. This is where we emphasize the importance of each population through its influence on the growth rates of other populations. So in this case, we have the Catharina, which is heavily influenced by the benthic diatoms and the Heterophyllum. And so we're saying that those are the organisms that influence that species the most. Within a community, the different trophic levels are influenced by both predation and production. So there are two alternative views for the effects of various trophic levels on one another, and those emphasize either top-down or bottom-up control. So bottom-up control would be where you have your biodiversity and the stability of your ecosystem determined by the producers. So in this case, if we say that we have grass, which is fed on by grasshoppers, which are a primary consumer, and then the secondary consumer are birds, we would say that we have to have enough grass to support the grasshoppers, and therefore there's enough grasshoppers to feed the birds. So in this case, you would have your ecosystem being controlled by the producers, where you have to have enough producers to feed the primary consumers to be able to support that secondary consumer. If the amount of plant material for some reason goes down, the number of grasshoppers would go down, and then it would no longer be able to support the number of birds. On the other hand, top-down control would be where we would assume that the number of birds is limiting the amount of grasshoppers, which allows plants to grow. So in that case, it's the organism at the top of your food chain that is controlling the levels below it and allowing enough plants to grow. So in reality, if you think about it, either of these things could be possible, and both of them might be working simultaneously, where you have both the importance of the producers and the importance of some of those higher up trophic levels that are affecting the stability of your ecosystem. So in the 1960s, there were some scientists that argued that the earth is green because carnivores depress the populations of herbivores that would otherwise consume most of the vegetation. So this is a top-down perspective, and it emphasizes what we call a trophic cascade. And you can test this by adding a third consumer level. So in this case, if you add a larger predatory bird that can eat those other birds that are going to eat the grasshoppers that eat the plants, you can see how that affects your ecosystem. So if you add that tertiary consumer, so if we add something larger like a hawk or an eagle or something, those eat the birds. If eating those birds then allows the size of the grasshopper population to increase, that will then cause the amount of plants, the number of producers, to decrease. And so you have this cascade of effects by adding that upper level of tertiary consumers. And so that effect sort of trickles down. And so that's what we would call a trophic cascade. And we can do things like that to see the effects on the ecosystem and see if it affects it or not. So if it's controlled by top-down control, we would expect adding that third consumer to affect the ecosystem. If it's bottom-up control that more is in control of this ecosystem, then we would assume that reducing the amount of plants would then reduce everything else within that food chain. So sometimes there are species that have a disproportionately large effect on the natural environment, and we would call these keystone species. So let's talk through an example that involves sea otters, because sea otters are adorable. We'd love to talk about them. So sea otters live in aquatic environments, and they eat sea urchins. Sea urchins are herbivores that actually eat kelp, which is essentially like seagrass. And so the idea is that the sea otters keep the sea urchin numbers in check, which then keeps them from overeating the kelp forests in the ocean. And so what we've seen through some human activities is that decreases in the number of sea otters allows the number of sea urchins to increase, and therefore that will decimate the kelp forest populations because there's no longer anything keeping those sea urchin numbers in check. And so in this case, the sea otter is a keystone species because it needs to be present in that environment, and without it, the entire rest of that ecosystem is going to start to collapse and reorganize. Some keystone species aren't considered keystone species because of their sort of predator-prey interactions within the ecosystem, but there also can be keystone species that are what we call ecosystem engineers, where they are species that create, modify, or maintain or destroy habitat. So an example of this would be beavers. So beavers take sticks and logs and things, and they create dams within rivers. The dams create sort of a moat around their dens, which are called lodges, and so it makes a protection for the beavers and their home where they live. However, because of that dam, it changes the characteristics of that body of water. So the water behind the dam slows down. It's going to change the temperature of that water. It's going to change the clarity of that water. And because of that, it's going to create new niches within that environment for other things to live. And so beavers are considered a keystone species because they modify their environment in a way that creates more diverse habitat for other things to be able to live there. Owls can also be considered keystone species because they create new habitats by making holes in trees and other things, and then other species are able to use those after the owls leave. And so for that reason, they're also considered keystone species because they're ecosystem engineers. So a few slides ago, I said that any community only has 4 or 5 trophic levels, and this is why that is. So energy is lost between trophic levels, and diagrams showing energy or biomass, which is the weight of living matter at each trophic level, shows how energy decreases as it flows from lower to higher levels. So if we say that primary production, which is the amount of plant matter and energy that is harvested by your producers from the sun, that is 100% of the energy available for that entire ecosystem. After that, things that eat the primary producers, so the herbivores, they are only going to get 10% of the energy from those primary producers into the next level. And then only 10% of that makes it to the secondary consumer. So 10% of 10% is 1%. And then only 10% of that energy makes it into the third level. So these are another level of carnivores. So now you're at 0.1% of that original energy. By the time you get to your apex predators, so by the time we're 4 to 5 trophic levels up in our pyramid, we're at about 0.1% of the total energy that was available in that ecosystem is available at the top of that energy pyramid. And this is because as energy changes levels, it's being lost through heat as well as a few other processes. So let's look at where that energy is going. So intratrophic energy transfers involve a few different components. So ingestion, which is eating food, this is the energy content of your ingested food. Egestion is the energy content of indigestible materials that are regurgitated or defecated. So this is food matter that still has caloric value that was not absorbed by your body and gets released from your body through your feces. So your feces actually have a caloric value because your body is not 100% efficient at using every amount of food and nutrients that you put into it. So if you eat a hamburger and it's got, 500 or 700 calories, whatever it is, your body might be able to use half or maybe 2/3 of that, but the rest of it is wasted, and that comes out through your feces. There's also energy that goes into assimilation, which is energy content of food that is digested and absorbed. So this is food that your body is taking in, it's breaking down, and it's assimilating into your body. So it's being used for cellular respiration. It's being used to maintain your homeostasis. It's being used to allow your muscles to contract, things like that. You have excretion, which is the energy content of your organic waste. You have respiration, which is energy that is consumed for just regular body maintenance. And you have production, where you have residual energy content for growth and reproduction. So some of that food that gets taken into your body is going to be assimilated into your fat tissues. If you are pregnant, it's being assimilated into the fetus, things like that. So all of the food that you take in is not accounted for in your body. It's lost through different processes. It's lost through your feces, different ways that it leaves your body. And so because of that, because first of all, energy transfer is not 100% efficient, and no organism is able to use all of the energy that it consumes. It does have some of it as waste products. All of your metabolism and things like that lose energy as heat, and some of that energy has to be used for your body processes. So as you move from one level to another, you're only able to use about 10% of the energy from one level to another. So by the time we get up to those apex predators, there's just not enough energy in that top level of your trophic pyramid to allow anything else to occur above that. So when we're talking about the base of a food chain, or the base of a food web, which is the amount of plant biomass there is, what we're talking about is primary productivity. We can look at primary productivity based on the gross primary production, or GPP, which is the amount of chemical energy that is created, which is typically expressed as carbon biomass. And that is the amount of carbon biomass that primary producers create in a given length of time. So it's usually denoted as the amount of carbon biomass per meter squared per year, or per centimeter squared per day, depending on the area that you're looking at. Some fraction of that fixed energy is used by primary producers for cellular respiration and maintenance of their existing tissues, and the remaining fixed energy, or the mass of the photosynthete, which is the amount of biomass that they're actually adding to themselves, is referred to as the net primary production, or NPP. So NPP is essentially gross primary production minus the respiration that has to be done by plants in order to maintain themselves. So we can look at, for example, this map of the United States, and you can see where GPP, which is your gross primary productivity, is highest. And you can see that areas that are lighter blue, darker blue, or even green have a higher GPP than areas that are brown. So for example, if we look at like northern Florida, southern Louisiana, areas over sort of in the eastern United States, those areas are going to have a higher GPP than areas in, say, Arizona or Montana, North Dakota, those types of places. And so we can use maps like this to see where most of our plants are and where most of our photosynthesis is happening. If we look at this on a global scale, we see something that we've kind of talked about a little bit in previous lectures when we were talking about biogeography and biomes and things like that. So you can see from this that the majority of the areas with high primary production are located in the tropics. So this would be areas where we would have tropical rainforests. And if you think back to those lectures, you guys should understand why this happens. So areas around the equator have conditions that are ideal for plants to grow. They are getting a lot of direct sunlight per meter squared. They're getting, they get the amount of sunlight that they get about 12 hours of light and 12 hours of dark year round, unlike areas towards the poles where the amount of sunlight you get depends on the season. The temperatures there are warm and you get a lot of rainfall. So if you remember, as the air around the equator rises, it drops its moisture and rains along those areas. And because of this, we end up with those tropical rainforests having lots and lots of different types of species of plants because the plants are able to produce for so many, for the entire length of the year. And because of that, you have a really large plant base, which can support a lot of diversity of other species of animals. And so areas near the equator that are in those tropical rainforests are considered biological hotspots because of those ideal conditions for plants to grow, which creates lots of different types of plants, lots of different niches within that environment, and allows you to have not only a lot of types of plants, but because of that, a lot of different types of animals. We can also look at rates of primary productivity to decide which areas should be prioritized for conservation. So unfortunately, we do not have time or resources to protect every natural space on the planet. And so we have to learn to prioritize the areas that are doing the most good for the planet. So if you look at this table, the majority of the Earth is covered in open ocean. We don't use open ocean for a lot of different things, so let's move down and let's look at tropical rainforests. So tropical rainforests only cover 3.3% of the Earth's surface. However, they're creating 22% of the Earth's net primary production. So when we're talking about places that we should clear for people to live or to get wood to build houses and other structures, is it better to take that wood from a rainforest, which has lots and lots of trees and other plants, but accounts for a small amount of the trees on the planet? However, it's creating the majority of our Earth's primary production. So it's where we're making the most of the energy from the sun. So if you think about it, if you were to take half of the trees from a rainforest, you're taking away 11% of the Earth's net primary production. If you were to take that half of the trees from a boreal forest or a taiga, or a deciduous forest, you would be taking instead about 4 to 4.5% of that ecosystem and half of those trees. And so when we're thinking about how to conserve different parts of our planet, we have to not only look at how many trees are available and how many resources are available, but also how important those places are to the health and stability of our planet. So essentially, the takeaway message is we should protect the rainforest because that's where we're getting our oxygen, that's where we have the most biodiversity, that's where we have the most species of plants and animals, and that's where the majority of net primary production on the planet comes from.